we've both been on a journey from being at one point much more sympathetic to Black Lives Matter and identity politics than we are now. And I think that that transition is part of what unites us. However, I think we got there in different ways and through different life experiences. So I'd like to start with that. And so perhaps you can explain that journey for yourself and talk about how you got from where you were at one point to where you feel you are now.
Mm-hmm. Also, thank you to the Brotherhood Synagogue for having us here, and thank you, Coleman, for this opportunity to talk to you. So I'll start with my background. In 2016, after the murders of Alton Sterling and Philando Castile, I organized a protest in City Hall building in Columbus, Indiana. And Columbus, Indiana is a very conservative, predominantly white Republican town. Vice President Mike Pence is actually from my city. And so BLMC, it started off spontaneously. I wasn't setting out to start a Black Lives Matter. But after I was packing up from the protests and I looked at my friend and I was like, I'm actually kind of sick of protesting, and I'm sick of the fact that I can reuse these posters again and again. And I want to do like some fundamental changes in our community. So long story short, it took about a week for me to organize how I would effectively implement a BLM in Columbus, Indiana, because we weren't like Ferguson, we weren't like Baltimore, we weren't facing these issues that they were head on. But I wanted to have an organization where we could hold dialogue about racial issues going on nationally and locally. So my suspicions, and I guess like when I became a skeptic of BLM, was at the tail end of my leadership with leading the chapter. Like Gloria said, I went to NYU for my master's in journalism, and that was in 2018 in August. So when I left in August, I think about 5 or 6 months prior is when I started to get these suspicions that the overall BLM narrative or message was a little off. I felt like something deep down was going to backfire on BLM by certain narratives that was going around with like white guilt, white fragility, and things of that nature. And it was actually these narratives that kind of sparked this confusion within me. And it's something that I kind of dealt with internally. But I started to become confused and I don't want to say worried. I'll just start with this example. So I started to see that these phrases, white fragility, white guilt, and these notions of white silence is complicit, your silence is violence for white people. It was a bit of a contradiction because when we want them to come to protests or speak out to their families or their friends or, you know, be vocal on social media, we wanted them to be, you know, very loud about that. But when it came to holding actual dialogue with people in mixed company, in intimate forums where like real discussion and real change could happen, it was almost as if we were saying, your silence, your being vocal here is violent. Like, we want you to be silent here because we're like, don't center yourself, don't cry, don't show any emotions, like don't exhaust the Black people in the room, don't overstep, don't overtalk. Like all of these rules were constricting the discussions. And even though with my chapter, I didn't implement this within our organization, but I definitely participated in this narrative online. Definitely reshared this narrative. I would even sometimes if someone asked me a couple of questions that I felt like I've answered before, I would be like, Google it and move on. And I would think that that was my agency. Like I felt like I had the right to do that. But I think right before I was about to leave NYU and I was stepping down, and I was just thinking about this with myself. I was like, I don't think, I think we're off on this. And I think we're going to see a big backfiring. And I think it's happening right now, actually. So that's kind of like my journey. There's other examples, but I'll let you go on because I know that you had your own experiences with Black Lives Matter as well.
Yes. Yeah. Well, for my part, I remember in 2012 when Trayvon Martin was killed, that was the first moment in my life where I guess the first moment after Obama was elected, but really the first moment where I felt like I was thinking about racism and on its effect on the most important things in life in terms of your ability to stay alive. I had always taken for granted that racism existed in the form of occasional nuisances here and there. But that was the first time that I reckoned with the possibility that someone in the year 2012 at that time could get killed, someone who was my age. I was the same age as Trayvon Martin. And it affected me. I remember I didn't follow the story closely, but from what I did see and hear, I was fairly shaken to my core and very sympathetic to the rhetoric, the anti-racist activist rhetoric that came on the back of that tragedy. So for the next 2 years, I had a kind of default positive attitude towards Black Lives Matter. I felt at minimum, they're on the right side of this issue in the broadest sense. Fast forward to 2014, Eric Garner is killed in New York. Michael Brown is killed in Ferguson. And the riots in Ferguson begin. And at this point, I'm about 18 years old. I'm just getting out of high school, enrolling at Juilliard as a jazz major. And we're talking about the Michael Brown incident in class with a professor whose intellect I was not generally very impressed by. And this professor took it for granted, took it as obvious that the policeman was in the wrong for shooting. Not only that it was a racist tragedy. It was a tragedy that could not possibly have happened had Michael Brown been white. And as I said, my lingering sympathy for Black Lives Matter made it so that was my default opinion as well. And I couldn't imagine how anyone who wasn't racist could have had a different opinion. Then I remember talking to my roommate about it at the time, who was my best friend at the time as well. And he was a white guy from Arizona with a kind of, I guess, slightly more conservative politics than mine, but I wouldn't call him a conservative. He was likely a Democrat, but he was skeptical. And the fact that I knew him not to be racist because he was my best friend and he was skeptical, it suggested to me that there's a standpoint from which you can be skeptical that doesn't entail being a racist.